So if you're wondering why I haven't been uploading videos, it's because of two reasons. First is because the last episode of Smartphone Isekai broke me and I can't figure out how to talk about it without having a mental breakdown. The second is because I've been dealing with some pretty intense episodes of depression. Oh my god, guys, I'm just like Guts. If you thought that joke was funny, I was almost going to do a segue about how Toya is just like Casca. Legit, though, there is something about Berserk that helps cheer me up when I'm feeling down, and since I've been feeling down, I've been thinking a lot about the manga and what I can learn from it as an author. And today I want to talk about an aspect of Berserk that I think goes a little bit unsung, and that is its impeccable story structure. You guys don't need to have read Berserk to understand this video, as I will be summarizing the plot, but, you know, spoilers. Before I start, though, please follow me on Patreon. Like, I need money for groceries. That's the place I'm at right now. You do get stuff out of it. I'm making these 3 really big videos, and most of the work I'm doing right now is on those projects, and while they likely won't even be done by the end of the year, I am uploading them in parts on Patreon, so if you like my content, check them out. Anyways, Berserker. Berserk is a story that works for a lot of reasons. The biggest one is, you know, the art. The art is quite good. Like, it gets talked up like it's the second coming of Christ, and having read it, frankly, it was a little bit underhyped, because it's not just that it has some really, really nice double spreads. Every individual panel of Guts swinging his sword in these fight scenes is a masterpiece, and that collective energy really carries the story to new heights. But the reason that Berserk is known for having this really special feeling to it, the reason everyone talks about it like it's this spiritual experience, is because of how holistic its quality is. It handles character drama, action, big war scenes, contemplative character studies, courtly politics, and world building, and every last one of those things is handled quite well. None so well as to carry the story on its own, but the collective effect of them is that the story is easy to get lost in. The reason the Campfire of Dreams speech is so effective isn't just because it's that well written, it's because by that point in the story you are so immersed in what's happening that it feels like you're there with Guts. But that feeling of being lost is an easy thing to lose. It only takes one weak plot arc for the audience to lose interest and for the whole experience to feel a lot less magical, but keeping the magic alive is one thing that Berserk is absolutely incredible at. And it's because of the way it paces itself. There are 2 ways it does this. One is easy to understand, and the other is what the rest of this video will be about. The first is that Berserk engages in decompressed storytelling, which is a fancy way of saying it really takes its time. It's full of subplots and asides, all of which are drawn in excruciating detail. Because it doesn't rush itself, because it has so many individual details, that makes it a lot easier to be lost in, so to speak. That much is somewhat intuitive to understand. If your goal is to make a story feel immersive, then making a world that feels alive and holistic by including way too many details is a pretty reasonable way of doing that. The second is that the manga essentially knows how to switch gears. The story it is telling is, despite its length, fairly simple in its broad strokes, but those broad strokes are important. Berserk is really 3 different stories with different tones, allowing it to repeatedly stay fresh and, more importantly, evolve and avoid retreading the same ground. Berserk never feels like it's stagnating, and every individual thing that happens feels like it builds off of what came before, rather than being more of the same, which should be impossible for a story where half the runtime is taken up by Guts swinging his sword at random mini-bosses the author pulled out of his ass. Like, there is a huge chunk of the story, roughly 35 chapters, about Guts trying to find a boat. A shocking amount of the story is just fighting elephants. What I'm describing is maybe a bit difficult to picture in your head, so let me map out the story for you. Berserk starts with what is called the Black Swordsman arc. We are introduced to Guts, an asshole-ish demon slayer plagued by a cursed mark which causes evil spirits to try and kill him whenever night falls. He has this mark because someone marked him as a sacrifice so that they could gain demonic powers, and Guts wants his revenge on this person. Along the way, he finds multiple people who themselves have attained demonic powers via sacrificing loved ones. These individuals are known as apostles. Chapter 1 is about Guts finding and killing one of these apostles, very impressive to do as he is a mere mortal. A lot of hype is made about how big his sword is. Chapter 2 is a short story about some travelers befriending him only for them to die when night falls due to his curse mark summoning a bunch of skeletons. And then, the rest of the Black Swordsman arc, lasting until the end of the 3rd volume, is about his conflict with a specific apostle, just referred to as the Count. So we have just enough episodic antics to establish the main thrust of the story and Guts' internal conflict. He is depressed and angsty because everyone around him is put into danger, he's driven by revenge, and so on. A big part of why the story works is the way it handles power scaling. Guts is strong enough to go toe-to-toe with absolute monsters, but a good portion of the story consists of him getting his ass kicked. He is fallible, and his ability to succeed largely comes from his ability to persist when in seemingly impossible situations, using everything available to him to his advantage. The story also introduces Puck in this part. Puck is an elf, more of a fairy than an elf, but whatever, he's called an elf, who is able to heal Guts' wounds and who acts as a moral compass, chiding Guts whenever he does something cruel and giving the edgelord a more sensible individual to bounce his edgy one-liners off of, adding depth to proceedings. Overall, we've constructed a fairly compelling status quo, but we immediately run into a problem. As things stand, it looks like the story is going to consist of Guts going around, finding a new bad guy to clash against, and taking them out. And that, is obviously going to get old. Everything there is to explore here was more or less hashed out in this section of the story, and a lesser author would have just kept spinning his wheels, but Miura understood that that was not the way to do things, so instead he did something bold. He wrote over 100 chapters of backstory. This is the Golden Age arc, explaining how Guts became the demon hunter we saw in the Black Swordsman arc. And the really brilliant thing about this backstory is that it works as a standalone tale. While you definitely lose out on a lot if you skip the Black Swordsman arc, 2 of the 3 adaptations of Berserk more or less just start with the Golden Age, choosing to tell Berserk not as the story of a demon hunter, but instead focusing on this backstory as a standalone narrative. The fact that Guts' backstory is so dense and long serves to keep the story fresh. Rather than retreading the same ground over and over again, showing us more demons for Guts to defeat in his path towards revenge, we are instead given a sprawling tale of medieval warfare, courtly politics, and character study. Guts, as a kid, knew nothing but warfare. Raised by a mercenary he later had to kill with his own hands in self-defense. He gets picked up by Griffith, the leader of a mercenary group with aspirations of one day owning his own kingdom. This is the Band of the Hawk, Guts' found family who slowly cause him to grow warmer and more friendly. Of special note are 2 individuals. First is Casca, Guts' love interest, whom he grows especially close to and even sleeps with at one point, and second is Griffith, with whom he has a close mutual affection and who we know will one day sacrifice the entire Band of the Hawk to demons. That's why Guts wants revenge in the Black Swordsman arc. He wants to find and kill Griffith for sacrificing everyone Guts knows to demons, and we start the Golden Age arc already knowing that. That tension gives the Golden Age a very distinct sense of forward momentum. You keep asking yourself when it's going to happen. Every time Griffith is humanized, every time he seems to be on the right track, it's a haunting thing because you know where it eventually ends up. What was already a great story filled with complex themes, complex characters, and compelling fight scenes turns into almost a mystery story because we got a vague spoiler about how it ends. Aiding this is the fact that despite how few fantasy elements are present in the Golden Age, occasionally a demon does show up, reminding you of how bad things are going to eventually get. There's this very real sense of anticipation. A very important aspect of this is how it explains how Guts became as powerful as he is in the Black Swordsman arc. He starts as a prodigy, someone trained in the sword from a young age and who's always used exceptionally large weapons for his size, but he isn't depicted as being unstoppably strong just yet. Over the course of the Golden Age, he fights and barely survives tougher and tougher scenarios, climaxing in his first ever successful win against an apostle during his fight with Wild. This sells you on him being a heroic figure within this world. It has the same effect as all of those moments in the Black Swordsman arc where Guts gets his ass kicked. Because we see him struggle, the moments he's an unstoppable badass feel earned rather than forced, and that entire process is greatly aided by the fact that this backstory was 100 chapters instead of 5. A shorter backstory would have made you understand how he got this strong. 100 chapters makes you live through it. As for the broader plot of the Golden Age, Griffith and Guts continue to find success as mercenaries and wind up being favored by the king of the Midlands, which is where the story takes place. All is going well until Guts decides that he needs to go off on his own to find his own dream, just like Griffith has his. Griffith, though, is both possessive and attached to Guts, so seeing that Guts left him, he has a mental breakdown and decides to sleep with the princess. This drives the king into a rage. Griffith is captured, and then he's tortured for a year straight. Guts returns from his journey of self-discovery and meets back up with his friends where they go to rescue Griffith. After fighting their way through a series of quirky mini-bosses, they are finally free, but Griffith is so crippled that he has no hopes of a dignified life, doomed to live as a tongueless babe, cared for by his friends without even the strength to choke out Guts or violate Casca, two things which he tries to do well in this state, so pitifully and incompetently that no one even notices that he's trying to. In the end, a solar eclipse takes place, and demonic magic transports everyone to a demonic realm where four demons known as the God Hand offer Griffith the chance to become a demon in exchange for him sacrificing his friends. Normally, this process turns people into an apostle, but demon rituals that happen during an eclipse allow the individual to ascend not merely to an apostle, but to a nigh godlike figure and stand among the rest of the God Hand. Griffith, of course, decides to make the sacrifice, leading to the most famous scene in Berserk. Demons swarm the Band of the Hawk, a group of characters we've gotten to know for, once again, nearly 100 chapters at this point, all suddenly wiped off the face of the earth by beasts beyond human comprehension. The only two to survive are Guts and Casca, rescued by a mysterious skeleton knight, though Casca had a much worse time than Guts and wound up with a broken psyche, no longer sane enough to even remember how to speak language. The fact that this scene works as well as it does isn't just because of the art. Like, don't get me wrong, the art is a pretty big reason, but the way the Golden Age was handled truly elevates it. Not only are the characters dying people we've grown attached to, but this is a thing which you've been anticipating for almost the length of the entire story. You are expecting not only the moment of Griffith making the sacrifice, but the moment that dark fantasy returns to the story, and because of the Black Swordsman arc, you have an idea of what all of that is supposed to look like, and none of your expectations prepare you for just how horrifying the imagery of the eclipse is. Despite the fact that you expect it, it still does kind of shock you. The eclipse goes on for long enough that even on rereads you get genuinely sucked into just how evil the setting is, just how viscerally alien all of these monsters are, and that sells you on the transition. This is when the story stops being the Golden Age, and the story of Guts fighting practical wars with swords and horses turns into the story of the Black Swordsman. After this, we get the Conviction arc, which is both the finale of Berserk and the halfway point. Okay, that makes no sense, but Miura is a visionary, so let me try and lay this out. The Conviction arc starts where the Black Swordsman arc left off. We get two sub-stories, Lost Children and Binding Chains. One is about Guts fighting an apostle, and the other is about him getting people wrapped up in evil spirits and having to protect them. So Black Swordsman sold us on a story, and Conviction is following through on it. It is Berserk spinning its wheels and doing more of this demon-hunting shtick. But only briefly. After these two arcs, it takes a sharp right turn into what is essentially the story's finale. It's not the end of the manga, but it is the end of the plot that got initially pitched to us. Berserk is a revenge story, and the Conviction arc is where Guts learns to give up on revenge. He had left Casca behind to go hunt demons, but now he receives a prophecy that Casca is going to die. Guts makes a commitment to never leave her alone again, goes to save her, succeeds in defying fate itself to do so, and then he finds Griffith. Members of the God Hand, which Griffith is now a part of, are too strong, too powerful to appear on the material world, but the entire finale of the Conviction arc is a series of pre-tested incidents which allow this rule to be broken. In other words, Griffith is back, and Guts now has a chance to confront him and enact his revenge, except now he's grown. Now he realizes there's something more important than revenge, so he abandons revenge to go take care of Casca. Everything that has been set up by the story kind of got concluded, save for the sole fact that the bad guy is still alive. This is an interesting thing that Miura did here. We got sold on a premise, the idea of Guts, the Demon Slayer, the Black Swordsman, and the collective page count spent on him being the Black Swordsman is less than that of the Golden Age, but it doesn't really feel like we missed out on much. Truth is, the story of the Black Swordsman was fairly simple, all things considered. Guts is just one character, and he's not that complex of one. An Odyssey story focused on him slowly learning to be less of an asshole only has so much ground to cover, and the fact that the climax of the story isn't an ultimate showdown with a final boss, but instead a single revelation, means that it can resolve itself fairly quickly. Miura, very wisely in my opinion, decided to cut this storyline off where it needed to be and didn't drag it out longer than necessary. This way he can avoid a situation where the story just spins its wheels for volume after volume for hundreds of chapters, which would have ruined the manga. Anyways, after the Conviction arc, the story spends nearly 200 chapters spinning its wheels, and it's the greatest thing ever. How is this possible? Well, let me tell you the genius of the Millennium Falcon arc. So, Guts learned his lesson and finished his character arc. Where do we even go from here? Well, the good thing about Miura's choice to have Guts abandon his quest for revenge means that he can now focus on a new quest: protecting Casca. This would, in theory, be pretty easy. She spent 2 years in a cave that protected her from evil spirits, and Guts initially plans to bring her back there, but it gets caved in when Griffith decides to show up and talk with Guts, and it devolves into a fight scene that, caves in the cave. Whoops! The only remaining place to take her where she'll be safe is Elf Island, the homeland of Puck, and so Guts goes on a giant odyssey to get her there, but there's a few twists. First is that, in parallel to Guts' stories, we also have Griffith doing his own thing. Thanks to the fact that Guts no longer cares about what the main antagonist is doing, the story is split into two separate halves. One half is Guts trying to save his kind of girlfriend, and the other half is the main antagonist putting his schemes into motion. Eventually, Guts will be forced to confront Griffith and stop his machinations, but for the time being, he is wholly concerned with Casca. The second has to do with the fact that during the Conviction arc itself, 3 characters got introduced: Isidro, Barnase, and Serpico. And during the Millennium Falcon arc, all 3 of them join Guts on his journey. He also meets yet more allies, such as Shirky, the witch's apprentice, and Roderick, a ship's captain. Finally, you have the expansion of the world building. Up until now, most of the story was focused on dark fantasy elements like demons and hell, but starting in this arc we learn that all of that is just one small facet of a larger fantasy world with mages and elementals and trolls and fire knives. The story can spend so much time going through the motions, nearly 200 chapters of it, because it had progressed into a larger and more complicated premise. By the time the Conviction arc had started, we were already recycling story ideas, and we were covering the psychological journey of a single protagonist who, let's be real here, wasn't quite complex enough to carry a story on his own for much longer. Even if these new characters are a lot simpler, Isidro's character is genuinely just that he wants to become as strong as Guts, the fact we have a whole cast to work through means that there's a lot you can do without it getting stale. It's easy to describe this transition as if the story got a lot schlockier. We transitioned from a dark and complex psychological piece that contemplated the nature of fate or whatever, and moved on to a story which is basically just a very well-illustrated D&D campaign. And it is true that people don't tend to go on dramatic monologues of thematic import in the latter half of the story, but that's because it's already written most of those checks by this point. A story can only have so many things that it can be about. Early on, Miura had characters go on profound monologues about those ideas, but that cartridge is almost empty by this point. The time for talk is over. Now it's time for action. The meaningful moments of the Millennium Falcon arc are fairly brief and often wordless, like when Guts looks over all of his friends playing in the waves, realizing that even though he lost just about everything, he is once again blessed with people worth cherishing. It's told in all of the small character moments in the midst of many fight scenes, in small decisions made by the characters, like when Guts, who had previously acted very misanthropic, decides that he is no way, no how, continuing his journey without one of his new friends. It's easy to hear about this transformation and assume the story got, corny, that it started leaning on overwrought tropes and low-hanging fruit, and the truth is that it is kind of doing that to an extent, but it works because it's also well considered. There's lots of low-hanging fruit that aren't picked because it wouldn't be appropriate. The only simple pleasures being given to us are the ones which are perfectly suited to the story being told. There is this deeply complex base on which it is being built. The idea of someone who'd dive off a ship to save someone close to them isn't a difficult thing to come up with. It is, in isolation, not a particularly impressive idea, but it is impressive when Guts and Casca do it because it's Guts and Casca. They've been through so much during the first half of the story that every little moment between them in the latter stretches feels so absurdly impactful. As she slowly grows more and more distrustful of him, she grows more and more trusting of Lady Farnace, who, in turn, is going on her own journey of self-discovery and atonement, which means that the moment Farnace swallows her fear to protect Casca from trolls who could easily rip her limb from limb is not just a powerful moment for her, but also one for Casca, and therefore for Guts, who also has a meaningful relationship with Farnace. Said relationship has to do with how, being with Guts made her grow stronger, and so this one moment strengthens not only her personal story, but also the dynamics between all three of them, and it does so in only a few pages. It isn't how low the fruit hangs, it is how you use it. I think it might be genuinely accurate to call Berserk's latter half certain things that are usually insults. Schlocky, corny, cheesy, cliche. All of these do a good job of describing the lighter sections of Berserk's story, especially in contrast with what came before, but they take on new meanings here. Cheese can work if it's in the right dish, and part of what allowed Berserk to hit so well is that Miura wasn't so enamored with the pseudo-mature atmosphere of his story that he'd decide against such a fitting and effective narrative decision. I talked about checks being cashed in, and that is absolutely true for Griffith's half of the story as well. In the Millennium Falcon arc, Griffith spends the entire time LARPing as a messiah figure. Using his ability to manipulate fate, Griffith goes on this big quest of defeating bad guys, culminating in him defending his country from the demon emperor Ganishka. He forms quirky friendships with people and makes passionate speeches about good moral values, and it's all played straight within the context of the scenes themselves, but you, the reader, have context. You know that it's all BS. He is reliving the glory days, reliving the golden age. He gets his hands on a discount Casca and a discount Judo and reforms the Band of the Hawk. All of his big talk about morals and values are empty words meant to make him look good. It's kind of pathetic. He did all this terrible stuff for ultimate power, and he uses that power to run away to a world where everyone thinks he never did anything wrong. More than any of the big speeches about complex themes, these moments make you think and reflect on the story itself and on our real world, about the nature of dreams, the nature of messiah figures, of how perspective and selective obfuscation can sculpt an entire alternate reality, and the nature of evil. It recontextualizes everything that came before it and is doing something that I haven't seen anywhere else, and that really just ties everything together. After about 200 chapters of all that, Guts and Griffith have another confrontation. Casca gets kidnapped, and we start winding up for the final showdown, which is where the manga is in present day, and it all feels really appropriate. At the end of the conviction arc, Guts and Griffith simply are not in a place, narratively speaking, to fight. It would be bad for the story if that happened, but there is a simple way around this. If Griffith just kidnaps Casca, then everything works out. Guts is now fighting for Casca, so he has a new reason other than revenge for him to fight the guy. But could you imagine that happening right after the conviction arc ended? It'd feel pointless. It'd feel like him getting over his desire for revenge was worthless, but enough time has passed that, you know what? Sure. Kick his ass, Guts. Guts, Farnese, Serpico, Isidro, all of our cast is at a point where they're more or less ready to finish things off and complete their hero sagas. The story of Guts helping Casca get her memories back was completed. Griffith got the kingdom he always wanted, but now these two have moved to a place where having accomplished those goals is no longer enough. There is more life for each of them to live, and the ways they plan on living those lives are incompatible with each other. I don't want to spin it as if Miura absolutely no questions asked needed 200-odd chapters to get us to this point. Berserk is absolutely longer than it needed to be in a broad sense, but that time was filled with very effective storytelling, and importantly, the time itself was utilized. The gap in time, the sense of distance, allows the story to feel as if it's doing things naturally, which is kind of important when your story about not getting revenge needs to end with you fighting the guy. There really isn't a conclusion to all of this. I just wanted to talk about how this story works on a technical level because I think it's something really beautiful. Talk about your favorite hashtag Berserk fact in the comments. Leave a like, subscribe, and make sure to follow my Patreon and all of that. I need groceries. And of course, a special thank you to my patrons, especially my Tier 2 patrons, Bellman, Carolyn Vig, and Love Your Content. My love for you is like a truck. Berserker! Do you want to making fuck Berserker? Berserker!